This project was ambitious. I started it 2.5 weeks before my big vacation to Colorado, which is bad enough on its own, but the deadline for it was sooner than that. Let's take a second to set the stage. With my vacation to Colorado right around the corner, my father and I already had 2 big projects to wrap up. And here I was, 2.5 weeks out, deciding to throw another hat into the ring. For those of you who don't yet know, I'm part of a local garden railroad club, the Rose City Garden Railway Society, or RCGRS for short. I joined back in January thanks to a combination of low membership dues and an amazing deal on G-Scale track, expecting that maybe I would participate in some events every 3 or 4 months. I wasn't expecting to really be a major part of the club. Well, one thing or another happened, and by March, I became the newsletter editor. My involvement in this club has far exceeded my initial expectations. In a good way, I've been enjoying my time. Learning new skills, meeting new people, once again having another creative outlet to share my joy for this hobby. The trouble is, ironically, as newsletter editor, I don't actually have any G-Scale trains. I only joined in January after all. I haven't really had the time to get one going yet. But the biggest club event is right around the corner. Or at least it was when I started this. Obviously this video is a little bit later than that. Every year, on the Saturday before Father's Day, the RCGRS hosts an open house tour where many members show their personal home layouts to the public. Well, as the new newsletter editor, I feel it is my duty to go out there and get some good pictures of the various layouts at the show. And, as a YouTuber, this is a prime opportunity for a fun challenge. Just imagine finishing off an engine of my own before the show and bringing it out to as many layouts as I can to run her. There's 2 reasons I'd like to do this, and yes, the first reason is obviously, it just sounds cool and gives me an opportunity to show off. But the second reason is continuity. I'm obviously making some videos to tie in with the next edition of the RCGRS newsletter after the show, and I work best with narratives that have some level of continuity and consistency to them. While I do want to showcase the various models and layouts at this show, having a quote-unquote mascot locomotive for a consistent perspective to follow on each layout may help keep some viewers on track. Plus, that same idea could apply to the newsletter as much as it would to any of my videos. Now, that's cool and all, but I only have 2 weeks to get this done. This project started conceptually on June 1st, and the train show itself is June 14th. And I know that for some of you, I may seem like an expert for my videos. I mostly do painting, and this project is going to take a lot more than painting. You see, while this project did start on June 1st, I've had an engine in mind for this project since January. A Bachmann Big Hauler 040 tank engine. However, this is a terrible idea and makes the challenge way harder because garden railroading works pretty differently from most other model railroading scales. You see, most model trains run from power through the rails. Depending on how much power, the train will go faster or slower, and depending on what polarity the rails have, the train will run forwards or backwards. That's how basic trains work. Digital command control has constant power to the rails and instead uses a chip in the train to control the motor, with coded signals running through the rails. But either way, what matters for this video is most trains take power from the rails to move. And in fact, that's what this big hauler engine does too. But that's not gonna cut it, because these layouts are outside. They get dirty, and dirty rails are less conductive, making it harder for your trains to run. Now, you can try to keep your tracks clean. Some club members do this, in fact. But some club members have half a mile of track on their layout. That is a Sisyphean task to keep clean. Because of this, most garden railroads actually run on dead rail systems, named such because there's no power going through the rails. Instead, you put the power in a rechargeable battery, put the battery in the engine, and then have a wireless signal straight from the locomotive to a throttle. This comes with an amazing benefit that any train can work on any track. You could straight up 3D print your own rails and the train would still run just fine. And so long as you bring your own throttle, it doesn't matter what control system any individual chooses, you can run any train on any layout. But for me, this poses a problem. As I mentioned, the engine I want to convert is a tank engine. While G-scale is large enough to reliably fit rechargeable batteries in your locomotives, tank engines have little to no space to house all the electronics needed to run them. In this locomotive, I would have to fit a battery, a motor, and a decoder to control the engine, all in one. Now, the Bachmann Spectrum variant of this tank engine actually has provisions for battery power. The tanks are built in such a way that there's an opening between the tanks and the boiler, allowing you more room to freely place your stuff. But I'm not using a Spectrum tank engine, I'm using a big hauler one. The tanks here are separately molded. In the area you wouldn't normally see is still a hunk of plastic, blocking room for the battery to cross between the tanks and the boiler. The solution? Convert this engine to a tender engine. That way, the battery can comfortably fit in the tender, freeing up space in the main engine so there's no conflicting stuff. Though, it certainly seems like I'm a glutton for making this project way harder than it needs to be. Converting the engine to a tender locomotive? Stuff was hard enough as is. Remember how the area between the tanks and the boiler is pure plastic walls that you're not really supposed to see behind? Well, since you can't see behind it, Bachmann didn't add any piping details. No sand pipes, no injector pipes. None of the details that you would actually expect to see on the boiler of a steam train. With how big garden trains are, and how much detail you can really fit on such large trains, this would be an obvious blunder for all to see, and it would hurt my soul. But as I mentioned before, I mostly do painting. I'm not skilled enough to add those kinds of pipes just yet. In order to pull that off, I'm going to need some guidance. Plus, I don't have a tender. I'm gonna need to grab one of those somehow. So, 2 weeks to buy and then build everything. No tender, skills to learn, a battery conversion to pull off. Those are the stakes we're dealing with today. Perfect for a YouTube video, and not for my sanity. Now, I guess I kind of lied at the start. I did actually have some G trains. I got some back in January and even started work on this project back then. However, as I mentioned, the trains started as track-powered, and that just won't cut it for this show. The engine I used in January is also not the engine I used in June. Unfortunately, the first engine I ever got has a split gear. Not fun, to say the least. It was so demotivating that even when I got a backup engine to try again with, I didn't even bother trying. I bring this up because some of the starting footage is from that first attempt, and technically on the different engine. The two locomotives are very similar. But the final product was done entirely in June. I'm just using this footage because I already had it and I figured I could skimp on recording the second time around. To pull off the tanks, I had to pull apart most of the locomotive first. The bottom was held in place with 3 screws. One at the front, below the smoke box, and 2 at the back, below the cab and around the area where the firebox ends. There's also 2 additional screws holding on the rear step of the locomotive, which I thought also held on the bottom. I was mistaken, but the rear step still needed to be removed one way or another, so there was no loss with that mistake. The pilot support struts also kind of held the smoke box in place, so they had to be pulled out of the smoke box. Though, when I tried this again on the second locomotive, I pulled them out of the pilot instead. Really, either way works just fine, it just depends on your model, you know? you might get more resistance trying to pull them out of the pilot or pulling them out of the smoke box. Do what works best for you if you're going to try and repeat this step. Next was 2 screws in the bottom of the boiler, followed up with 4 screws that were hidden in the boiler, 2 screws per tank. After this, I screwed back in the boiler bottom and called it a day there. Well, okay, I actually did a lot more work at this point, but none of it wound up on the final product, so no reason to really show it in depth. At this point, I needed help with the piping and boiler detail. I had ideas on how to make it work, but I wasn't really confident in myself and wanted some advice from more of a skilled modeler. And I knew exactly who to ask for help. While I am still fairly new to the RCGRS, as the newsletter editor, I'm learning a lot just from the articles people are sending me. Sometimes I'm learning about actually building things, sometimes I'm learning about club events, sometimes just about club members and their favorite niche of the hobby. And one person that's been consistently submitting articles is Bruce McKinney. I don't think I should tell you why I think he's the perfect candidate. I think I should show you. These are just some of the models that he's done that he's shown me. I should have taken photos of his collection when I visited. I really don't know why I didn't. His modeling work is stellar. And hey, he loves sending in articles for every newsletter and sharing some small tips on how he does his detailing. If there was ever anyone capable of showing me the skills I needed for this project in just a single afternoon, Bruce was the guy to do it. So I asked to meet up to get a little help, and he said, sure thing. The first thing we did was add handrails. The tank engine did have some to begin with, but they were only on the smoke box, and the handrail is supposed to run the whole length of the boiler. Bruce used a Dremel to carefully open up the insides of the new handrail stanchions we were going to use. Most of the detail parts we wound up using were white metal castings from Ozark Miniatures. In this case, the stanchions had a little bit of leftover flash material in them. On top of that though, we had to open up the space a little bit so that we could fit some styrene tubing in there. After the flash was removed, he marked out some spots to attach the handrail stanchions to using a pencil, and then used the Dremel again to drill out holes for them. The holes that the original handrail stanchions used were actually perfectly sized for the new ones, so we just reused them and lined up 2 new holes in the boiler to match them. Bruce then added the stanchions one by one, adding a piece of styrene tube in the middle as the handrail. While the styrene did kind of naturally bend on its own, it helped us to align each stanchion appropriately so that we could then glue them in place the right angle. Once all the stanchions were in place, we cut down the styrene rod to length and did the other side. After having watched Bruce do it, I had no trouble following in his footsteps and doing this side entirely by myself. For the injector pipe, I had to detail part of a pipe bend. Bruce drilled a hole for that and got the bend in place. For the rest of the pipe, he used an aluminum wire and bent it into shape. The injector pipe isn't straight after all. No duh, there's a bend at the front where it enters the boiler. But there's also a bend near the back where it climbs up from near the bottom, where the running board is, to about the middle of the cab, where it's better leveled out with the top of the firebox. We had a little bit of trouble getting it to glue into place, so to help with that and to help with alignment a bit, Bruce added some bits of styrene pipe that was just large enough to fit around the wire. And this helped give it more surface area when gluing it to the cab, and helped to keep it lined up with the pipe bend. The running boards on this engine were insane to me. Bruce finished them in like 10 or 12 minutes. He started by cutting some pieces of wood to the approximate length and width that we needed, and then he rounded out a corner of each using a stencil, a knife, and a stick of sandpaper. For the edge, he took a strip of styrene, cut it to length, and glued it in place. This was a little rough to do thanks to the bend in the edge, but with enough patience and superglue, the pieces stuck together fine. At this point, we realized we forgot holes in the running board for the sandpipes to eventually sneak through, so we marked out some spots and cut those in. With a little more superglue and a lot of tinkering, we eventually got the running boards in place on the locomotive. This was kind of hard because the material that the locomotive is mostly made out of doesn't really handle superglue all that well, so we had to actually glue it to the weight inside of the engine to help keep things steady. The last thing that Bruce helped guide me through was the headlight. I wanted it to sit out in front of the smoke box on a small bracket, just to give the engine a little more personality. For this, we pulled out the original headlight after cutting its wires, and covered the hole with a couple of styrene sheets. Admittedly, we didn't need to do this. It'll be hard to see the area where the hole was thanks to the new headlight bracket covering the space, but it was good to do just for consistency's sake, you know? Once the glue settled in, which took a while because the material didn't want to stick very well, he added some small styrene strips to help elevate the headlight bracket so that it sat above the smoke box a little bit more than before. He then fabricated a small bracket out of sheet styrene, once again using the stencil, a knife, and some sandpaper to help round out the outside-facing corners. And for one last tiny edit, Bruce added a hood for the headlight. Admittedly, I didn't really do much while visiting Bruce. I kinda just watched and absorbed as much information as I could while he did his magic. He got in his headspace, got working, and I didn't want to interrupt. And I most certainly learned a thing or two from him. After all, we haven't done the sandpipes at this point, right? We'll talk about that later. In the end, I walked home with a great start to a cute little tender engine and tons of ideas floating around in my head. Unfortunately, I did undo the hood that Bruce put on the headlight. I did like the idea of adding a hooded headlight to this engine, but on this particular headlight enclosure, the proportions just felt off to me. And that's no fault of Bruce's, it's just what we had to work with at the time, and the headlight was too vertical while the hood was too horizontal. So, I wound up removing it. For the tender, I dragged in a channel supporter, average RPG character. RPG loves garden railroading, and RPG loves 3D printing. A match made in heaven for what I wanted to do. The tender I initially wanted to use was a scaled-up variant of the one on my recent HON 30 project, that being Nicolisa's 4-wheeled porter tender. Once RPG scaled it up, though, we found the tender was too small for the battery that I ordered. The tender was about 5 inches long once scaled up, which is about the same size as the battery. You have to remember, the battery has to hide inside the tender. You gotta sell the illusion, right? With the lengths that we had, the battery would be poking out somewhere on the tender, and that's not what I wanted. So, I next went to another community member's design. Maybe Crazy did a full tender conversion for this exact locomotive using only 3D prints a couple of months ago. Obviously, I would just need the tender, but when I went looking for it, I couldn't find a link. I asked them directly where I could find it, and I found my problem. It wasn't ready for public use. Now, maybe Crazy did fix up the file and send it my way, but because of the time crunch we were under, I only had so much time to get this project moving. And by the time they had sent me the files, RPG was already printing out our third and final option. Another HON 30 tender scaled up. Since this tender was already designed for another 040, I figured it would make for a good option here. And with an internal space of about 5.5 inches in length once scaled up appropriately, there was just enough room to squeeze in the battery. So, RPG got to printing it, which took about 3 days and 3 printer failures, and then shipped it to my doorstep, where my father spray painted it with primer and then in a nice coat of Badger Model Flex Engine Black. The trucks on this thing were a nightmare. RPG sent over some metal wheel sets to help assemble the trucks, But the center of the wheels, which I believe is called the head, and no, I'm not talking about the axles, I'm talking about the wheels. The center of the wheels stuck out too far and would bind against the inside of the trucks, rendering the whole thing unusable. At first, my father tried using a Dremel to cut down the axles. We didn't realize it was the wheel heads at first. Eventually, he was going to try cutting down the heads too, but we found that Bachmann plastic wheels rolled just fine. So, I cut some notches in the underside so we could actually push in the axles, and then just used the plastic wheels instead. Problem solved. For the battery conversion, I didn't actually record how we wired it up. Getting the camera to record while my father was working was kinda tricky, so I just gave up on the idea and instead tried to take occasional photographs to show progress. But it's not too hard to understand. In fact, I can show you a diagram of basically what we did. If you've ever wired DCC and sound into an engine before, it's that, but you just replace the track power with a battery. For those of you who haven't done a DCC and sound conversion before, basically, you take a little chip and wire it to a bunch of things. In our case, we needed a pair of wires for the battery power, a pair for the motor, a pair for the speaker, and a pair for the headlight, which we did have to worry about getting the polarity right on. Unfortunately, for the headlight, we used a resistor that was too strong. Since this was a G-scale engine, we figured we should use the stronger resistor since more power would be pushed into the system, but we made a bit of a mistake on that assumption. In fact, we made a decision that some of you who are more informed about G-scale might call a serious blunder without additional context. We used an HO scale Bluenami decoder, specifically the 2200. The reason I went for this in particular? It was cheap. As I will say time and time again, until my finances improve, YouTube does not pay very well. My budget for this project was a bit limited. But before I committed to this idea, I was a little bit concerned. What if the motor uses too much power and exceeds the decoder's stall current design? Basically, if the engine's wheels are forcibly stopped while the motor is still turning, how much power will that use? Will that burn up the decoder? Well, the 2200 is designed for 2 amps motor stall current. The motor, when stalled, uses only 1.5. We were very much in the clear here. Now, the battery I used was also a bit cheap. It was a random Amazon battery with 9800 milliamp hours at 12 volts. The Bluenami decoder needed a minimum of 7 volts and a maximum of 22, so I hoped this would work out okay. Not because of the power output, but because it was a cheap Amazon battery. Fortunately, I had no troubles. By now, we were under a serious time crunch. There was less than 12 hours until the show began. Fortunately, everything was functional. Well, aside from the headlight, which didn't work thanks to that resistor, but whatever. The speaker worked, the motor worked, the battery worked. All that was left to do is my favorite part. Painting. And a little bit of detailing too. Which, actually, now that I think of it, I did a bit of detailing off camera whenever my father wasn't wiring up the engine. Let's talk about that real quick. Following Bruce's advice, I added sand pipes to both sand domes using some aluminum wire that he sent me home with. I also spent some time adding a second injector pipe on the left-hand side of the engine, with a slightly different design up at the front than the one on the right-hand side. If anyone ever notices that, which, let's be fair, they probably won't, it's on 2 different sides of the engines, but if anybody does ever ask me about why that's the case, I'll just tell them it was a tank engine conversion, and the shops that did the conversion did some weird choices along the way. It's true, after all, and it's actually something that could have happened historically. After all, so long as it worked, the railroads didn't care. With the injector, though, instead of using styrene pipes to hold everything in place, I used heat shrink. It's a material commonly used for wiring, where you cover exposed solder joints so they don't accidentally cross and short out your wiring. You then use your soldering iron, apply some heat to the heat shrink, and it shrinks to wrap around the joint. Here, though, it was the perfect size to wrap around the wire and the pipe bend. So that's exactly what I did, and after getting the shape of the pipe just right, I superglued everything together. As for the stuff I actually recorded, Bruce let me take a few detail parts home with me. I had some fun painting those up. For tool handles, I used Ceramcoat Territorial Beige. I put this on a broom, shovel, and a pickaxe, though I sadly misplaced the pickaxe shortly before the show and didn't get to add it to the engine. If I ever find it, I'll definitely put it on somewhere. I also put a tiny bit of Territorial Beige on a water bag for the cab. For the shovel and pickaxe, I used Citadel Color Iron Warriors for the metal heads. It just felt right, with a nice dark shade and a good slight shine to it. With the broom bristles and the water bag canvas, I used a Citadel Color Morghast Bone. It fit quite well. I then used some Citadel Color Red on, I don't know broom terminology, whatever the stuff is that I'm showing in the video. And to round things out, I gave the broom head on the water bag a light coat of Citadel Color Nuln Oil Shade to help bring out the depth of the castings. This was such a good effect that when I showed my father the broom, he thought it was factory painted. With the main engine, I started with a coat of Citadel Color Abaddon Black. I find this color matches most Bachmann boilers pretty well, and this was no exception. I painted any parts that weren't black or had some pencil markings, and I eventually painted the smoke box in black too. I then realized I hadn't glued on the brake shoes, so I did that. We had to cut these off of the original locomotive since they were attached to the water tanks, and clearly we aren't using those anymore. After both of those had a little time to dry, I then painted the top of the running boards in Citadel Color Catachan Flesh. I wanted to highlight the use of wood on the running boards while darkening the color a bit so it would better fit in with the rest of the engine. I also put a splash of this brown on the pilot. For the headlight bracket and the handrails, I used a Citadel Color Daemonet Hide. I thought a little splash of something different would be nice for the engine, and I just so happened to have purple on hand. And to really make things pop, I used some Citadel Color Retributor armor for a lot of details on this engine. The drivers, the boiler bands, the whistle, the piston caps, the pilot support struts, a lot of stuff. Since this was so down to the wire, I did wind up skipping recording even more steps, but there's not too much to note here. Most of what I did was glued on some more detail parts. I guess it is worth mentioning that the biggest of these was a 3D printed air pump that RPG gave me. And with that, my first Garden Railroad engine was finished an hour before we made it out to the show. This is Tara. Tara is anything but perfect. Her speaker is too quiet, her headlight doesn't work, her paint job was rushed and could have been done much better in a couple of places. I didn't get all the details I wanted on her. But you know what? I don't think anybody but me noticed. She did what I needed her to. She went out on the Garden Railway tour, visited a couple of layouts, got some fun photos and videos, and a couple of compliments from strangers. I definitely need to do some work to fix Tara in the future, but as she stands now, I love the way she's turned out. And trust me, I have tons of videos and photos of the layouts that I visited, and tons of videos and photos of her. If you want to see that, I'll be posting a video in a week about the Garden Railway tour and the 4 layouts that I managed to make it to. And at about the same time, the July RCGRS newsletter should be going live. Keep your eyes peeled for that. I'll make a community post when the time comes. Thanks for watching. Cheers, folks.